Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vijay Gurbaksani. I'm the director of the Center for Digital Transformation at the Paul Merard School of Business at UCI. We're delighted to welcome Sinan Aral today to talk to us about his new book, The Hype Machine. But before I introduce Sinan, I just have a few words to say. So first of all, good afternoon to those of us on the West Coast. Good evening to those of you. We have people from London and Milan joining us today, Sinan. That's your draw. So welcome to people from Europe and the East Coast. I'm really excited for a variety of different reasons today. One, some of you may not know this, but there's something called the Irvine School of Social Informatics. So back in the 70s and 80s, before I joined UCI, there was a whole school that talked about how computers transform society. And we sort of lost sight of that mission for a while just because we became so focused on how we can create value for businesses. And now sort of in the times we live in with sort of the scope and penetration of digital technologies, we are transforming society once again in ways both good and bad. If you think about what's going on today with the global pandemic, a consequential election in a few months, and of course, social unrest, all of these are influenced by sort of social technologies. We are lucky today to have Sinan Aral speak to us. I could not think of a bigger authority than Sinan to talk to us about how social technologies are transforming society and the economy, like we said, for better and for worse. Sinan tells this funny story about how when he approached his advisor to talk about wanting to do research on social media and what it might mean, his advisor said, what the heck? Well, I'm not sure if this is going to turn out to be that much. I'm putting words in my friend Eric Reed-Olson's mouth. But what Sinan doesn't know is I actually thought the same thing myself. So when, we've known each other for a long time, and when I first heard him talk about what he was interested in one of our many academic conferences, I didn't say anything to Sinan. I didn't know him that well at that time, but I'm like, I hope this pans out for you, my friend. And it has panned out in spades. I can't think of anybody else who studied social analytics with as much rigor and as much thought as Sinan. He's done it for 20 years. He started this before Facebook was even around, but those were the days of MySpace. But beyond being an economist and a social scientist, he's an econometrician, but he's also worked with the big social media companies. He's worked as a chief scientist at companies like Human and a couple of other companies. And he's now an investor as well through a venture capital firm. So he brings a wealth of experience to what he's going to talk about from an academic perspective, from an executive perspective, from an investment perspective, and as a concerned citizen of the United States. So with that, Sinan, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Welcome to all of you again. I have one last thing to say before I turn it over to Sinan. We're taking questions through the Q&A function in this webinar, not through chat. So please start posting your questions via the Q&A feature on the Zoom webinar link. And with that, take it away. Thank you again, Sinan.
Absolutely. So thank you, Vijay. Thank you, everyone, for having me. It's a huge honor. This is such a fantastic audience of experienced business executives and technology scientists, as well as just concerned citizens. So I'm very pleased to speak to you today. As Vijay says, this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. Back when I started, people who were not as kind as Vijay warned me. They said, why would you want to be studying thousands of pictures of chihuahuas that look like blueberry muffins? And I said, this is going to change the world. I had an epiphany probably about 20 years ago that this was something really important, that it was going to be a fundamental transformation in our information order globally. And so what I'd like to talk to you about today is what I call the hype machine, the social media industrial complex and its effects throughout society. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and go into, looks like the host has disabled attendee screen sharing. I think you need to make me a host in order for me to share my screen. I'm now a co-host. Thank you very much. Very seamless. Appreciate that. Hopefully everyone can see this screen here. Right. So this book is called The Hype Machine. It's about the social media industrial complex, how it disrupts our elections and democracy, how it disrupts our economy, our businesses, and how it disrupts our public health from the coronavirus to the recent outbreak in measles, and how it affects our behavior worldwide. And so if you remember back in 2016, we had a big concern about interference and the use of social media manipulation by Russia. The Senate conducted an investigation of Russian interference into the 2016 presidential election. And that investigation found that Russia propagated at least 126 million messages, or reached 126 million people in the United States on Facebook, 20 million people on Instagram, 10 million tweets to 6 million followers on Twitter, and 43 hours of YouTube content, all propaganda designed to interfere in the 2016 US presidential election. This year in 2020, it's even worse, because not only is Russia involved, but the intelligence agencies have indicated, and our own research is indicating, that other countries like China and Iran and others are participating in social media manipulation and interference in the 2020 election. It's during a global pandemic with justifiable civil unrest due to the death of George Floyd here in the United States. They are much more sophisticated than they were in 2016 and 2020. Rather than impersonating US citizens, they are nudging US citizens to spread misinformation themselves, which makes it much harder to root out because the accounts are genuine. They have moved their servers from foreign soil to US soil to avoid domestic surveillance, because foreign intelligence defense in the United States is much more limited on domestic soil. They've infiltrated Iran's cyber war department, perhaps to launch attacks through Iran. And we are no more prepared now than we were in 2016 in possibly the most consequential election of our generation and maybe of the last 100 years in the United States. It's not just about elections and democracy, however. It's also about business and stock markets. So in 2013, in April 2013, the Associated Press put out this tweet on its Twitter handle: "Breaking: 2 explosions in the White House and Barack Obama has been injured." This tweet was retweeted 4,000 times in 5 minutes, and it went viral thereafter. But this tweet was not real news propagated by the Associated Press. It was fake news or social media manipulation that was propagated by Syrian hackers who had hacked and infiltrated the AP Twitter handle. And this wasn't an isolated incident, because we have designed socio-technical systems to ingest and act on social media information. So we have systems in companies like Dataminr and Raven that train algorithms to trade on the sentiment in social media. So when this tweet was tweeted back in April 2013, it triggered trading algorithms to trade on the sentiment around the possibility that the president had been injured or killed in an explosion in the White House. And that triggered a drop in the stock market, which wiped out $140 billion in equity value in a matter of minutes. And that's from a single tweet. So imagine a systematic or coordinated attack involving tweets reaching 126 million Americans. What might happen then? And it's not just about democracy and elections, and not just about business and stock markets, but it's also about our health and our public health. There is a wealth of misinformation about the COVID pandemic, just as there was a wealth of misinformation about measles before that. And this information is propagated in systematic ways through automated software robots and also through people. And before COVID, there was measles. So if you think back to measles in 2019, and you think back to the propagation of anti-vaccine misinformation on Facebook, all of which is described in my book, and you think about the case of measles, measles was eradicated in the United States in the year 2000. In 2010, there were 63 cases of measles over the entire year in the United States. In 2019, there were 1,250 cases of measles in the first 5 to 6 months of the year alone, an 1,800% increase in measles in the United States. And it was concentrated around these areas like Clark County, Rockland County in New York, Clark County in Washington. And it turns out that the ad buys on Facebook and other social media around anti-vaccine misinformation are incredibly well correlated with the outbreaks in these areas. All of these stories are told one by one in my book, and this book is about social media and how it is disrupting our society in those ways, but in many other ways as well. Now, social media is not just about the peril. It's not just a technology that can disrupt our society, our democracy, and our health. It also is a tool for good. So for instance, when the largest earthquake in the last 100 years hit Nepal, it moved a lot of people, and it also created a lot of displacement. Facebook has a feature called safety check, which essentially tries to find people in crisis situations. And when the earthquake hit Nepal, it located about 100 to 300,000 people that were deemed missing. And it informed 8 to 10 million of their friends and family that they were safe in a matter of minutes. This was possibly the largest simultaneous sigh of relief that has ever gone across the planet in a single moment. But that wasn't all that Facebook did at the time. Immediately after the earthquake hit, it spun up a donate button to get donations for relief efforts. While Europe donated $3 million to the relief efforts, the United States, 10 million, Facebook donated 15.5 million, gathered from 770,000 people in 175 countries, more than the US and Europe combined. This technology also plays a huge role in social movements, from the Arab Spring to the Snow Revolution in Russia, to Hong Kong, and now to Black Lives Matter here in the United States. Each of these stories is also told in the book, and social media's role in organizing and accelerating social movements, and how it can be both very powerful and very fragile, given the nature of organizing that happens on social media. Another great example is the Ice Bucket Challenge, which raised $250 million for ALS research and ALS efforts in 8 weeks over Facebook. We have estimated, for instance, here at MIT, and researchers at Stanford have estimated the economic surpluses generated by the services that Facebook creates alone. And it's been estimated that essentially Facebook creates about $370 billion in consumer surplus in the United States alone in a single year. And it's a free service that people can start businesses on, that they can conduct their own individual economic activities on, they can stay connected with friends and family, and so on. But all of these great stories about the positive potential of social media are in stark contrast to the very legitimate concerns that people have had prior to the COVID pandemic. Before the COVID pandemic, we had Sacha Baron Cohen calling social media the greatest propaganda machine in history. And we had Cambridge Analytica and Alexander Nix. We had the Netflix documentary, The Great Hack, about what's happening to our privacy. We had the Delete Facebook movement and then the Stop Hate for Profit movement. But when the pandemic hit and we had shelter-in-place orders, we all scurried off the streets, into our homes, onto the internet and online, and all of these services saw a dramatic increase in their use. Facebook, Netflix, YouTube, and others. We saw essentially, these services breaking records every single day during the pandemic. And it showed us just how vital these services are for getting medical information, staying connected to friends and family, being connected in a work environment. And during the future of work, which is going to be more digital than ever before due to the COVID pandemic, these services are going to be even more essential. Right now, we stand at a crossroads between privacy on one hand and insecurity on the other, between free speech and hate speech, between truth and misinformation and falsity on the other hand, between democracy and authoritarianism, between connection and political and social polarization. And social media doesn't cause all of these things, but it plays a role in all of them. And in the book, I describe the technology trifecta that created social media, from the rise of digital social networks almost overnight, the rise of smartphones, and the rise of machine intelligence. If you think about it, just about 10 years ago, or maybe 15 if you are conservative, all we had to communicate with each other digitally was the phone, the fax machine, and email. And today, we cannot live without the indispensable technologies like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to connect us to other human beings around the world. And the interesting thing about this technology is that I have an entire chapter on the neuroscience of social media, about how it affects our brains. And our brains are built for this technology. There's something in neuroscience called the social brain hypothesis, which hypothesizes with a lot of really good evidence, all covered in the book, that the reason why our brains are so big, why the neocortex ratio relative to the rest of the brain and why our brains are so advanced is not because of manipulative dexterity or logical reasoning, but because of sociality, because our social hierarchy is so complex that our brains need to be able to discern much more about social information. Who knows who knows what. We are what is known as fifth order intentional, which means that I can know not just that Joe is African, but that John knows, that Sarah knows, that Jim knows, that Jeff knows that Joe is African. And that is fifth order intentional. No other species on the planet is fifth order intentional as far as we know. Now, what is social media? Social media is essentially a cacophony of social signals that our brains have evolved to process. And in that way, when you put trillions of social signals into digital technology, for a species that has evolved essentially to process social signals, it's like tossing a match into a pool of gasoline. It also hooks us economically through network effects. I described why Facebook beat MySpace, and you might be surprised by the answer. A lot of pundits have a lot of different explanations, but the answer was actually written down in a paper that was written in the economics literature by Rolfs in 1974. In section 5 of that paper, he describes Facebook's go-to-market strategy as being a strategy where you launch in clusters of people that are friends and you launch them together. In other words, one college campus after another. And what this does is it ignites local network effects. It ignites the cohesion of people that know each other. When we logged onto MySpace, the likelihood that we knew anyone else on MySpace was very low. But when we logged in for the first time to Facebook, all of our friends were on it. That's why it was so sticky. There's a whole chapter on the economics of this in the book. The neuroscience plus the economics plus what I call technical lock-in or walled gardens is what makes social media so addictive and makes it impossible to imagine a world without social media. the fact that we can't take our data with us means that if you use Instagram as a photo scrapbook of your memories in life, you are unlikely to ever leave Instagram because you can't take those memories with you when you leave. What drives behavior through social media is what I call the hype loop, the continuous dialectic between machine intelligence and human behavior, between structure and agency, where the machine senses what we read, who we friend, and what we buy, and uses that information to optimize functions for our engagement and our continued use of the technology through friend suggestion algorithms, feed algorithms, and advertisements, basically dictating what we see and read, and then our ingestion of those suggestions to consume and then act on that information is the loop that drives behavior. And we have 4 levers to affect change, which are money, code, norms, and laws, the incentives around the business models, the design of the technology, the norms with which we use the technology, and the laws that we use to regulate the technology. We obviously had a very important antitrust hearing. In the book, I talk about whether we should break up Facebook, and you might be surprised by the answer. So we need to regulate many different aspects of this technology, antitrust, speech, privacy. We need to think about whether we're going to be breaking up Facebook or not, and how that may or may not solve all of our problems. The position that I take in the book may be counterintuitive, but I believe that the antitrust question is a panacea. That in essence, there are fundamental underlying economics that no matter what we do with antitrust will tip these markets into monopoly unless we devise some structural reform of the social media industrial complex. Privacy is a huge issue. The GDPR, California has its own privacy law now, and we're seeing a patchwork in the United States. That patchwork is unsustainable. I suspect in the next 18 to 24 months, we'll see big moves towards federal privacy legislation in the United States. What should that look like? What will be the effects on machine learning-based businesses? What will be the effects on scientific research if data sharing is restricted? What will be the effects on other types of important questions like election integrity? How can we audit elections and social media manipulation of elections if we cannot collect that data? And how can we do all of those things while still preserving the moral and utilitarian value of privacy in our society? We've written papers in Science, for instance, about protecting elections from social media manipulation. What are the exact steps we need to follow to do that? The main message of this book is that there is both promise and peril to social media, and that we can achieve the promise of social media while avoiding the peril. And the book is about how we must adapt, how we can achieve the promise while avoiding the peril. There are a lot of social media books out there that describe how the sky is falling and how it's disrupting our society, our democracy, our elections, and so on. This book is intended to try to go beyond that, to provide real solutions. And that's essentially why I wrote it after 20 years of research. It comes out September 15th. Pre-orders are available now, and I'd love to have a conversation about it. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and thank you all very much.
Hey, thank you, Sinan. That was fantastic. Sinan was kind enough to send me a preview copy of the book, and I have to say I speed read it over the last couple of days. So I don't think I would advocate speed reading this book. It's perhaps the most informative book I've read about social media, and as a professor on the subject, I read a lot on this. I forgot to mention that Sinan is the director of MIT's initiative on the digital economy, was in the slides. But before that, he was also the director of the social analytics lab. So what you see in the book is a lot of evidence-based research around social media in particular. We're calling it the hype machine, but there's also a lot of hype research that probably isn't as rigorously conducted as what we read about. And it's not only about Sinan or MIT research, it's about sort of a wide plethora of research that we see everywhere. But with that, so I want to explore a few themes, and to the audience, please feel free to start typing in your questions. One of the things, so let's pick up where you left off, because you know, we've all heard about the doom and gloom scenarios around social media, and all of us sort of struggling in our own in our own little ways about how do we adapt. And another talk I heard you talk about, sort of, it's like the Titanic approaching the iceberg, but it's not technological determinism. We as humans can do something about it. Humans must be in the loop. So what are your messages around things that we can do to make the outcomes more likely to be good outcomes?
Great question. And thank you for that. As I said, I wanted this book to not be another book about the gloom and doom of social media. I wanted it to recognize all of the tremendous risks that we face with social media today, but to focus on how we can adapt and what we can do about it. And really, as I describe in the book, and as you rightly point out, there are these two camps, right? There's this camp of technological determinism. You know, we see everybody from Elon Musk to others saying, you know, AI is going to destroy the world, you know, and so on. I think that technological determinism is a bit fatalistic, and it at once absolves us of the responsibility of doing something about technology, and it allows us to abdicate that responsibility at the same time. So I think that humans play a huge role in this. The laws we design, the business models we pursue, the norms that we instantiate while using this technology, and the code we write that designs this inside the social media industrial complex itself. Those are the four levers that we have. And each of those four levers are outlined in detail in the book. You know, there are so many opportunities in the next 18 to 24 months around laws, regulation. So I'm talking about, and you hear about this every day in the news, privacy legislation. What are we going to do with Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act? How are we going to deal with private ownership of data? What are we going to do about protecting our elections? Do we need, you know, risk-limited audits? Do we need to protect the cybersecurity of voting machines? Do we need to have some sort of legislation and or an understanding of these companies' willingness to give data to understand how we're being manipulated? In addition, obviously, money. So the business models and incentives, everything from should Twitter be a subscription-based service rather than advertising-driven or Facebook, all the way through to should vaccine-related misinformation or COVID misinformation be demonetized in terms of advertising. Both of these have to do with the lever of money. Obviously, norms, the norms that we adopt in these communities, the norms that we post to these communities determine what the machine sees that we want. There was this great study, which I detail in the book. My friend and colleague Iyad Rowan, who used to be at MIT and now is at the Max Planck Institute, did this AI. He focuses a lot on how can we study what the outcomes of algorithms are based on their inputs. And he created a image and video labeling technology, two versions. One that was fed a steady diet of violent images, and one that was fed a steady diet of normal images. And then they were subject to Rorschach ink block tests. And the one that was fed violence could only respond with violence. And the one that was fed normal images responded with pleasant descriptions of the images that it saw. So this gets to your point about humans and machines. We get out of this technology and the algorithms what we put into it. Another great example is Tay, Microsoft's chatbot on Twitter. It was manipulated to become a racist Nazi because it was fed racist Nazi propaganda. And so our norms matter is the point of those two examples. So money, norms, laws, and obviously code. How are the algorithms designed? Trending algorithms, algorithmic amplification, and how can we think about the design of the technology to achieve the promise and avoid the peril? We're at a crossroads. 18 to 24 months is a key window of opportunity.
Yeah, so two quick reactions. This discussion about technological determinism has been around even in sort of non-social media contexts when I was preparing for introducing you. So this conversation around factories, we tend to take the position which is robots or other forms of automation will replace humans, and it's only a matter of time. And it's what jobs will humans, what jobs can robots not do as well enough as humans, and those will be the jobs that humans have. But really, we need to be making choices about sort of how we leverage this technology. And at our center, we believe that every company needs to think like a software company, but so much gets lost in the code because it's really not visible, to the public eye, and that's something that needs to be explored. I want to switch. I'm just going to ask a couple more questions, and some of the questions that I wanted to ask already being reflected. But one of the questions that's on everybody's mind these days, of course, is TikTok. India's banned TikTok. Microsoft is in talks apparently to buy it, and the news keeps changing on that rapidly. So I have several questions. What do you think about all of that, and what does it even mean to separate a company that is a social network, which relies on network effects, but you've got it owned in the rest of the world by ByteDance, but over here it's going to be owned by Microsoft. I'm not even sure how that works, but what do you think of that whole situation?
Well, I mean, this example is such an example that rolls up so many of the issues of the day into one example, all the way from the role of social media as geopolitical football between China and the United States, obviously, to the notion of network effects as you describe. Obviously, Microsoft, my guess is, would hope that the network effects and interoperability of TikTok across China and the United States would stay intact, but that the laws governing the data of people in the United States would govern the Microsoft portion of it, but not the China portion of it, and vice versa. The trouble with all of that is that data assigned to an individual in a network is pulling into it data from its orbit in the network itself, which can obviously bleed out beyond the US portion of the network. And in addition, I think it has to do with this notion of antitrust. Certainly, it would be interesting from Facebook's perspective in the antitrust case if Microsoft were to own TikTok, and the concept of monopoly and it is, what is the definition of the market?
Yes.
Is China separate from the US? If Microsoft owns the US version, does that mean that now Microsoft is a large competitor to Facebook and so on? These are all very open questions. Early days, it'll be very interesting to watch as this unfolds. And I think that the frameworks in the book will help us really think about not just this, but each of these instances as they come up, and they will continue to come up.
And I think that's one of the sort of the real powerful aspects of the book, which is once you abstract it back to first principles and start thinking about from that point of view, it doesn't matter whether the devices are smartphones or virtual reality headsets. So the impacts we can analyze based on the frameworks you lay out in the book. Let's talk. You mentioned antitrust, and there's a lot of different takes on antitrust. So there's Lina Khan from Yale, who actually informed the Senate committee recently, or the House committee, I think it was.
I think she was sitting behind Cicely, if I'm not correct. I think that was her.
Yes, in fact, they said it was one of the most informed sets of questions, though. Lina Khan, for those of you who don't know, was a Yale scholar who's written sort of a fairly novel approach to antitrust. So now I want to explain sort of what the previous view of antitrust was versus what you do in a free input-free economy.
Yeah, so, antitrust in the United States has a long history, but if I could summarize the recent pivot, it's that Robert Bork kind of devised this notion of antitrust being about consumer harm and being narrowly defined and propagated mainly this perspective propagated by the Chicago School of Economics, that consumer harm can be narrowly thought of as being about prices, about a monopoly's ability to charge high prices, which obviously doesn't apply very well to free products. Now, the argument that is being made today is that the harm to consumers can take many different forms. So it could be a loss of privacy. It could be a disruption of democracy. It could be the negative externalities of all of the perils that I described in the talk, whether it's, the effect on democracy, effect on our public health, and so on. And so when you shift, and I think we are seeing shifts in the antitrust framework of the United States, in the antitrust hearing last week, but also in all of the writing, Lina Khan's article that's now very famous is titled The Antitrust Paradox.
Right.
And it's about trying to argue this shift away from consumer harm as being narrowly defined as prices. The thing I really want to argue in this book is that it's one thing to think about whether or not we should break up a single company. It's another thing to think deeply about the underlying market economics that create an environment that tips companies into monopoly, which I argue in the book is a combination of network effects, and specifically local network effects in the digital social networking space, combined with a lack of interoperability, a lack of portability. Those two things, in my mind, are really the two pillars of the foundation of the economics of this industry that tip it towards monopolies. And my feeling is that no matter what we do in antitrust, if we don't commit to structural reform of the social media economy on those two dimensions, then we will be in this position again and again and again, and we will never have real competition in social media.
So reading from the questions and the Q&A of this, that's actually very well aligned with what you just said. Let's talk a little bit about data and interoperability, because what does it even mean to port data from a Facebook to whatever social network you want to move to? And then, of course, you've got this whole dimension of Instagram Reels, which is now competing very aggressively with TikTok and has launched a whole bunch of creator tools and so on. So, and the second question we've got, and I'm going to throw them out together in the interest of time, is cybersecurity, especially around the TikTok situation, but around global social networks. So data interoperability and cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. So the notion of portability is critical and challenging. So why is it critical? Well, if you think back to the chat wars, when in the AOL Time Warner merger in 2002, they were forced to essentially interoperate their chat, AIM chat, with MSN Messenger, Yahoo Messenger, and so on. And that reduced AOL's market share from about 65% to about less than 50% in 3 years. And then it ceded the entire chat market to Facebook and Google and others. Interoperability played a key role. If you think about telecommunications, it used to be that we couldn't take our cell phone number with us when we switched cell phone providers or carriers. Once it was instituted that number portability was instituted, it created competition, or more competition, in the cell phone service market. When it comes to social networks, what does it mean to have a portable social graph? Well, Senator Kennedy, when he was asking Mark Zuckerberg, can I take my data with me? Can I, is my social network portable? Mark Zuckerberg, in his kind of naive, act in a way, said, well, Senator, you can do that now. We have a download your social network button, which when you press it, by the way, gives you a printout of all of your friends' names and their IDs on Facebook, which isn't very portable or useful. Now, the question becomes, what does social network portability mean? In my mind, it means being able to interoperate between different social networks and to take your social network connections metaphorically with you from one social network provider to another. The trouble is, defining property rights over a network is not easy. So it's not like owning a number. And so, for instance, Josh Gans has called for an extension of thinking around social network portability to what he calls identity portability, where you would own your identity and you would then port your ability to message across platforms and therefore have an ability to continue your connections to anyone you're connected to on platform A when you switch to platform B, or multi-home in platform B, and be able to communicate. The trouble is the messaging is not compatible currently. You know, Twitter is 240 characters, Snapchat messages disappear,
Right.
Facebook goes beyond 240 characters, but there are ways to make them interoperable. There are a lot of smart people in these companies. Interoperability, I don't think, is a technical burden. I think that it's claimed to be a technical burden because it suits companies who are in market positions where interoperability would threaten their competitive advantage. So in terms of that, I think we need to really think about social network portability, identity portability, its relationship to network effects, if we hope to achieve competition in this market. With regard to cybersecurity, obviously, data that is collected by TikTok is, you know, subject to Chinese law, and that law is essentially a transparent venue for government to essentially read anything and everything that exists in Chinese company databases. And so there are going to need to be conversations about international standards for data integrity. We're already seeing, essentially what we're seeing now is the beginnings of that. So we're seeing 3 frameworks arise, one in Europe, one in China, and one in the United States, which sits in between Europe and China in terms of where it sits on the privacy spectrum, for instance. The US is trying to figure out what it's going to do. Once we have these essential poles or polarities of views on privacy and data security, we will then start having an international conversation about harmonizing across, right? So the EU and the United States has to have some sort of compact for data harmonization, and some exists already, safe harbors, memorandum of understanding, and so on. Those will need to be developed as we proceed. But I think logically and sort of ethically prior to all of that is that we need to decide what we believe in terms of the value of privacy. Is it a fundamental right or not? I mean, we can go all the way back to Griswold v. Connecticut in the Supreme Court, and we can think about penumbras emanating from the Constitution, but not actually having a constitutional protection for privacy in the US Constitution. What does that mean? It needs to be developed through legislation, obviously. But how does that balance against other needs? In other words, how can we do Alzheimer's research if we can't share data? How can we protect the integrity of our elections if we can't audit our elections? Because and if all of the companies are required to expunge all their data, how can we know how they're affecting society? All of these are really important questions that are all discussed in the book and that we're going to have to grapple with as a global society moving forward.
So one thing we haven't touched on this, so actually, let me close because we're running out of time already. And my apologies to the number of people who have questions. This has been one of the most dynamic sessions we've had. We're not going to be obviously able to get to most of these. We'll screen grab them, and hopefully Sinan can answer a few of them by email, because I think they're all really important questions. I'm having a heck of a time choosing. I want to ask you 2 questions. One is sort of, we haven't touched on synthetic media at all today. And that's a huge risk because, you know, with deepfakes and so on. And then second, I wanted you to close, and I'm going to ask you the way the news anchors ask you to do it in 60 seconds. But, you know, the balance between norms and regulations. And you refer to, you know, some people are calling it values. You're calling it values. Other people in the chat are calling it norms. But if you could touch on those 2 really quickly, and then we'll wrap.
Yeah, so first of all, chapter 2 of the book is called The End of Reality. And it really, so we wrote a paper in 2018, which was published in Science, on the spread of false news online. And chapter 2 extends that into the present day and talks about generative adversarial networks, the rise of deepfakes. What we've seen so far in terms of deepfake technology is just scratching the surface in terms of audio fakes and video fakes. And we can speculate about what would happen if we have a subtle injection of video and audio misinformation that is, you know, they say, you know, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and seeing is believing. Well, if that's true, then what does that mean for our sense of reality and the rise of fake news? That's all covered in chapter 2. And I think that in terms of our values, that's a nice segue to values and norms, because we really need to, we haven't really grasped with we haven't really grappled well with the question, what are the implications of this technology and our use of this technology? And what trade-offs do we want to make on a number of dimensions in order to achieve the promise of social media and avoid the peril? And there are definitely trade-offs. I mean, certainly in an isolated vacuum sense, we want to encourage innovation of technology that creates the ability to do generative adversarial networks. You can build high energy physics experiments using GANs because you can create synthetic data very quickly, and you can have tremendous advances as a result of that. But there are also dangers to this technology. And this is an example of a trade-off. And there are numerous such trade-offs that we face, all of which are sort of outlined in the book. And I think that we need to move from this notion of, Vijay of 15 years ago thinking to himself, I don't know whether social media is going to really be that important. I hope Sinan is okay in his career. But now that we see, wow, it's affecting our elections, it's affecting my business, it's affecting the stock market. Now we have to actually grapple with the core questions that this technology raises. And I think we're just beginning to do that now, just starting to do that now.
Well, Sinan, I cannot thank you enough. That was absolutely fantastic. You have another meeting to go to with, to the CIO Roundtable. Please log into another link. To the audience, thank you so much. We'll find a way to keep you engaged with Sinan, but in the meantime, buy his book. It's released September 15th. Like I said, I've read it. It will answer many of the questions you're asking in the Q&A. But more importantly than answering the questions you have today, well, I think it will give you a framework to think about these issues in the longer term as these technologies keep advancing and our uses of them keep evolving. So with that, thank you everybody for joining us today. A special thanks to my friend Sinan, and we will see you at our next event. So thank you all very much for attending.